And we're live.
No, it's the pregame show. Oh, wait.
No, it's not the pregame show. We are live because today I set up the auto start on YouTube, and therefore the blue go live button can no longer be the bane of my existence because we just start automatically. And for the Twitter people and the Facebook
it's up,
people,
by the way, Ben.
What is?
YouTube is working.
I know, yeah, it's kind of cool how it works.
Why have we not done that for 426
We haven't done it because
days?
we have wanted very badly to have the pregame show, and this obliterates the pregame show. But anyway, we are live. It is Tuesday, Thursday. Whatever kind of day. May 27th.
Friday, actually.
2021.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
It is midnight Friday morning Israel time. It is 9 p.m. Reykjavik time. It is 5 o'clock New York time, and it is 4 p.m. before my dinner with Ada Palmer after the show, Chicago time. We are not allowed to have fun anymore. And to reinforce the point, we're going to talk about Israel and Gaza, who have really not had fun the last few weeks. To do that, there are many people who I would like to discuss this subject with, but none more so than Tamara and my old friend Noah Efron, who we have known since Tamara has known since Noah was her professor at Tel Aviv University when she was an undergraduate, and is one of the few people I have basically known my whole adult life. Noah is the voice of the Promised podcast, which, if you have any aspirations to have any understanding of Israeli politics, is kind of the best weekly source for not just the political, but also the cultural and the underlying, I would say, fragrance of Israeli life. He is a longtime resident of Tel Aviv and who flits in and out of the Washington area, having grown up in Silver Spring. Noah, welcome to In Lieu of Fun.
It's great to be here. It's really great.
So I am drinking a very nice scotch out of a plastic cup. Which seems like the only way to handle this situation. Noah, get us started.
But can I just say that you're doing this at 4 o'clock, right? Drinking out of a plastic cup?
Yes.
Before 5. I just want that on the record.
It is on the record.
But as Ben has proof of, because of this show, it is indeed 5 o'clock somewhere, including on.
Right. And I also just want to say the premise of the show is that Kate and I get together and have scotch.
Sure.
And so whatever time I go live for In Lieu of Fun is inherently time for a bit of scotch. Noah, get us started. One of the oddities of this latest round of conflict is that so many of the concurrent Israeli-Palestinian conflicts erupted at the same time. So give us a little overview of the different things that were all going on at the same time over the last few weeks.
Okay. About 3 weeks ago in Tel Aviv, there were demonstrations that were pretty brutally put down by the police after a rabbi of a yeshiva in Jaffa. Tel Aviv is now Tel Aviv Jaffa. Jaffa is, of course, the 4,000-year-old city that predated Tel Aviv, and it was pretty much entirely Palestinian before Israel was created, and then it was conquered by Israel after Israel was created, and it has been contested ever since. 4% of the population of Tel Aviv Jaffa are Palestinian citizens of Israel. 96% are Jews, and in a traditionally Palestinian neighborhood turned mixed neighborhood, yeshiva was founded, and about 3.5 weeks ago, the rabbi of that yeshiva, who was originally a settler in that he lived in a settlement in the occupied territories, but has since turned his attention to Judaizing parts of Jaffa. He was beaten up by two homeless brothers, who suspected that he was trying to expand the yeshiva to further take over homes that had traditionally been Palestinian homes in this neighborhood in Jaffa. It was a complicated conflict, but it burst into demonstrations and arrests and petrol bombs being thrown in the streets and rubber bullets being fired on demonstrators. And this was a precursor that was barely noticed outside the borders of Israel. It was really not that much attended to outside borders of Tel Aviv. But it was a start, and it was a harbinger, and it was also a sign, I think, that there was a growing feeling of frustration among Palestinian citizens of Israel, especially younger Palestinian citizens of Israel. Then a week after that erupted, while it was still simmering, but it was starting to quiet down, then there was a lot of, during Ramadan, there was a lot of unrest in Jerusalem, some over Israeli forces limiting the access or the kinds of access of Palestinians to the mosques, and largely, as it turns out, over a long-standing struggle in a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah that probably most people have heard of by now, because that was much reported, where 5 Palestinian families are in danger of being evicted from their homes, titles to which are held now by a Jewish NGO that wants to replace these Palestinian families in the houses that the NGO officially owns. The legality behind this is very complicated, and so there were demonstrations, as there have been for years in Sheikh Jarrah, but as the courts were speaking about this particular case, they grew angrier, and the police grew more violent. All of that was happening, and Jerusalem became a site of some violence, and that is when Hamas. That's the reason that Hamas gave for launching its first rockets in this recent period of violence were actually launched on Jerusalem, which is something that one almost never hears. And then immediately rockets were launched in other areas in Israel, and the 11-day battle between the IDF and Hamas was on, during which time 1,000 Palestinian apartments in Gaza were destroyed, 5 high-rises were destroyed, 17 hospitals were damaged. And in Israel, there were 2,800 apartments or stores were damaged, and 1,000 cars were destroyed by bombs and by rioters, whom I'll get to in just one moment. And I think that everyone probably knows, over the course of the 11 days, it's a bit over 230 Palestinians in Gazans were killed, of whom 67 were children. And in Israel, 13 people were killed, of whom 3 were children. That happened, and almost immediately after the after the rockets and the bombs began to go back and forth, then there were riots in what are called mixed cities in Israel, cities that have a significant Palestinian population in Israel, cities like Ramla and Lod and Haifa, in addition to Jerusalem. And in those places, there were basically, vigilanteism and thuggery of all in all directions. There were gangs of Palestinian citizens of Israel, mostly teenagers or people in their lower 20s, who were roaming through the streets and destroying cars and beating people up and setting fire to synagogues, setting fire to Torah scrolls. And then there were groups of Jews, including reports of some Jews who bust themselves in from settlements, who went and beat up Palestinians. And in the course of those riots, a number of people on each side were killed. You've probably seen the film of a Palestinian citizen of Israel, taxi driver, who was dragged out of his car in Bat Yam by a group of Israelis and beaten near to death. He's in the hospital. Still, he'll be fine.
No, may I ask something? So one of the events which was prominently reported in the American press, but you haven't mentioned, and I'm wondering whether it's been blown out of proportion, is the cutting off of the speakers at the AlAqsa Mosque, the prayers, which then caused confrontation in the mosque and then to the Temple Mount. Was that a highly significant event?
It was a highly significant event, and I should have mentioned it. It's part of a family of events. I mean, probably the most dramatic of which is that Israeli soldiers went into the mosque during prayer, guns drawn, and then there was a story where the police stopped dozens of buses filled with worshipers on their way to the Temple Mount, 15 or 20 kilometers outside the city, in order to, ostensibly the story of the police is that they had word that there were, that there were malefactors. There were people who were threatening to do violence on those buses. They wanted to root them out. But in the end, you had this, the night before the first bombs came from Gaza, you had basically 1,000 Palestinians walking by foot in this very dramatic way for 15 kilometers up to Jerusalem and to the Temple Mount, walking through most of the night. And of course, rumors spread, or I don't know, rumors/reports, the social media and WhatsApp were filled on the Palestinian side with people saying that, this is the moment when the Jews are taking from us these mosques back, and we must fight to save Jerusalem. And that again was the reason that the leaders of Hamas gave for attacking Israel, precisely that.
So go ahead, Noah.
Just to add one last thing, while all this was so, I have a lot to say about what it was like to experience this. But one of the things that was true while this was developing is it seemed like the news filled up with film of people on the street beating each other up. And of course, when the rockets came, then we had a certain number of seconds to get into a fortified room, or in my case, to grab up the dog and take the dog into the stairwell. Things were very fraught, and at that moment, it seemed almost inevitable that the West Bank was going to suddenly set itself on fire, that we're going to see this as well. And then there were reports that Hezbollah in the north was considering beginning to rocket into Israel as well, which would have made the north a front too. So it felt for a number of days as though the whole world was collapsing into this place, and that it didn't seem clear that it was going to, how it was going to end. And then after a few days, then this settled into the more familiar Gaza, Israel lobbing back and forth of explosives with the asymmetrical results that we know. But for a couple of days, it just felt as though hell had been released, and it was unclear whether it would ever be contained again.
So I want to just break some of those threads out because, so for those of you who don't follow Israel-Palestine issues, there are at least 4 distinct threads here, right? So there's Israeli Judaization of Arab neighborhoods, which has been going on in one form or another for a long time, and resistance to that in places other than Jerusalem, right? So there's some of that. You describe incidents in Jaffa, which I frankly knew about only because of your podcast. Actually, it was, as far as I know, it was not substantially reported on here as well. Sally Abed, whom you've had on the podcast pretty regularly recently, reports that very similar activity has happened in northern Israeli cities, particularly in Acre. And so there's that stuff outside of Jerusalem. Then there's, communal sort of Judaization of Jerusalem neighborhoods, which is more fraught because Jerusalem is actually contested. The Israeli government doesn't acknowledge that there's a contest, but it's a contested territory in a meaningful sense. And the question of how much of Jerusalem, if at all, if any, is Palestinian is an active, open question. And these efforts are efforts, among other things, to resolve those questions by what Ariel Sharon used to call facts on the ground. Then there is the Israeli-Hamas dynamic, which is I guess a quasi-international thing. Hamas isn't a government, but the Gaza border is a real border, and you have violence across that border. And then you have Israeli domestic street violence between rival ethnic gangs, basically. And none of these things in and of itself is new, although I don't think I've ever seen Israeli domestic street gang violence at that level before. But all of those things, right-wing Jews marching, chanting death to the Arabs and beating somebody up is something we all kind of have seen before, and its converse is stuff we have seen before as well. Seeing them all at the same time strikes me as radically new. And I'm interested in what felt new about it to you, and whether for you primarily what was going on was the Gaza rocketing situation, or when you say the whole world felt like it was, falling apart in this place, how much of it was these other things?
That was wonderful. And to that, probably, I guess we have to add the fact that Israel is in this ongoing governmental crisis. And just before all this happened, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu lost the opportunity, or failed to take advantage of the opportunity that he had to form a new government. And that went to an opposition leader, Yair Lapid, who was busily trying to negotiate an odd government that would have replaced Netanyahu's government, that would have included political parties that are quite far to the left and quite far to the right, and this is the most important thing, I guess, for the very first time, an Islamist party as well, a Palestinian Israeli party called Ra'am, would have been either part of this government or would have supported this government, and that was about to take shape when all this broke out as well, adding more to the feeling that everything is unstable. So what what was extraordinary about this, it seemed to me, well, like you said, the fact that it was all happening at the same time, and this is like the most subtle thing about this very unsubtle situation, and the most important thing, I think, but it's really hard to hold on to and come to understand, is that the fact of the way in which Palestinian citizens of Israel responded, and the sudden, explosion of this rage. So there were the thugs on the ground, which, hundreds of people on each side, which is, an important story because it's so upsetting. But there were thousands of, or tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Israelis who were outraged by, well, all sorts of things, by years of discrimination, some of it like profound structural discrimination, and a feeling as though they had repeatedly been promised a real place in Israeli society and Israeli politics, and it hadn't yet happened. Okay, so and the mess going on in our politics and the negotiations over a new government that included, for the very first time, like I said, this Islamist party was part of that, because Palestinian Israelis felt for the first time as though they were going to be authentically represented in an Israeli government, and authentically have access to power and to the ability to make decisions, and have a real ear on the in the Israeli government, and then I think that the frustration was expressed with such force, in part because we have just experienced, I think, one of the moments of, if not the moment of, the greatest hope among Palestinian Israelis that they could be part of society. And these things are always dialectical. There's always a relationship between the extreme frustration and this feeling of hope. So this moment seemed to me to be like, it was both at the same time the most depressing moment that I've experienced in the 30 years that I've lived in Israel, and also in some ways the most profoundly optimistic moment, because for the first time that I've seen, Palestinian Israelis were seen and were seeing themselves as people who had a right to be treated entirely as equals in this society, something that I think to the parents of the people who were demonstrating, the Palestinian Israelis, would have been unthinkable. And so it's kind of this exquisite moment of frustration born out of a feeling that hope is being dashed, and recognition of the fact that, oh my God, for the first time, there's a kind of hope that didn't exist before among young people. So the expectation, for instance, in Jaffa, that Palestinians not be gentrified / forced out of their neighborhood for ethnic reasons, the feeling as though that's outrageous, is something that didn't exist before. And I think that that's like an important political resource. It's like the way that where this leads to is not at all predetermined. It doesn't seem at all that this isn't, to me, obvious that this isn't part of a story that ends up being a big step forward, though it could also be a part of a story that is a big step backwards. And that's, of course, the way that it's been widely interpreted.
So
just for people who want a sense of how complicated the identity of this Ra'am party is, I, a few years ago, met with the spiritual leader of this party, who has since died. He was a man named Abdullah Nimar Darwish, and Sheikh Darwish was he was a fascinating man, and I don't know what I expected from him, but he articulated in a few short sentences what I thought was the most, I don't know, I was very moved by it, actually, account of what a religious Muslim party and his party is, part of the International Muslim Brotherhood. It's a, it's something that if it were in the United Arab Emirates would be banned. What he should sound like, and his articulation of that was the following: I am a human being. I am a Muslim human being. I am an Arab human being living on my land in the state of Israel. I do not violate its laws. I do not denigrate any of its citizens. And I thought that was just a remarkable statement. There are many things to object to about the Ra'am party. For example, its views of LGBT issues and all kinds of other social conservative matters, but its relationship with the state of Israel is super interesting and super complicated. And Noah's point that the idea that they were on the point of being the pivotal votes in the government, which is a position that has traditionally been occupied by the ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties, was a remarkable thing, and that they were going to do that under a right-wing prime minister with left-wing support is just a fascinating development that this whole thing disrupted. Sorry, I couldn't, since you brought in Ra'am, I couldn't help but bring in Darwish.
No, that's beautiful. Kate, did you want to say?
Oh, I actually had to check this with Ben because I'm woefully uninformed about this topic. But Ben affirms to me that the last time there was a conflict that was really significant was in 2014. And so one of the things that you said in describing the events were just like you've mentioned a number of times, you've probably seen the video of, you've probably seen all of the videos of like rioters or people getting dragged out of their cars or like all of these things happening, and the news has all of these videos, and there is something about, and then like this being such a an interesting kind of conflagration of like four different things has been kind of articulated. I'm really interested in like, do you think that social media, and not just social media, but the advancement of like kind of technology, the ability of hardware and like broadband internet to convey video files, for example, I certainly think it has had an effect on the democratic culture of the United States with like things like Black Lives Matters and like things like and everything else. But I'm just interested if you think that has had any type of role in this most recent flare-up.
Yeah, I mean that's a wonderful point. Absolutely. I mean, in all the ways that probably you'd imagine. I mean, for one thing, I think that part of the rage that suddenly just became the air that we breathe was not entirely manufactured by social media, but was certainly sustained by social media and found, and found a home on social media. And so the fact that every small offense, I mean, one of the things that I didn't mention, there are an infinity of details, but there was as the tension in Jerusalem was ticking up, there was a TikTok challenge in Arabic among Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinian citizens of Jerusalem to film yourself punching or beating a Jew. So there were a few very famous incidents over those couple of days leading up to the tensions in Sheikh Jarrah and at the mosques on the Mount. One, an ultra-Orthodox guy was sitting reading his Torah on the light rail in Jerusalem, and this kid came up and just punched him in the face while somebody else filmed it, and then it turned up in TikTok. And there were a number of these videos, and there were some in Jaffa as well. And so it worked in that ugly way that we know that social media often can do. It also worked in a way that was certainly much, was not ugly, had all sorts of impacts in, I think, creating a sense of Palestinian solidarity with what's happening in Gaza and solidarity with what's happening elsewhere. Not that social media was necessary, or not that that solidarity was new, but once the bombings were underway in Gaza, then I think that immediately everyone, and particularly Palestinian citizens of Israel, knew everything that was going on there and watched these videos. We all watched these videos over and over again of homes turned into rubble, and that had both effects that you'd expect. It increased the level of anger, and also I think that it increased sort of a way that people that have looked at Israel for a long time or lived here or been involved were sometimes surprised by, including me, of creating an unexpected solidarity, including a solidarity between Jews and Palestinians. This is another unique thing about these past couple of weeks, is that we have had demonstrations. We've had joint Arab-Jewish demonstrations in 100 different places in the country, and including an online demonstration that brought a 250,000 people under the slogan that Jews and Arabs refuse to be enemies together. And that kind of solidarity among the left, or people who were outraged by the violence, or people who were upset, or people who were upset with what was being done in their name by their own people, that was something that was new as well, that I think could not well have happened without social media. So yes, it was super important in all directions, and it made everything more extreme as well, for worse and for better.
It also struck me as like a real, it struck me as a great moment of silos, not great moment, a really low moment for silos, but a moment of silos in which I was watching my Twitter feed, and there would be rockets. I was getting images of rockets being fired over Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And then I would be watching my Twitter feed, and it would be like all of the buildings crumbling in Gaza and all of the bombings and everything else. And then there would be the things that are like social media is this, I'm like totally blanking on the name of this app now, but it's where you can see by a map all of the videos being posted in real time in like a current area. But I'm just like blanking on what it's called. But anyways, a number of people basically saying that this was the best way to observe the conflict, because it was like you could see how completely out of touch it was, that the Western media was only reporting on the side from like Israel. And actually, kind of like when you went and clicked through all these videos, a lot of them were still just like boring videos of like people making dinner or doing whatever. And it was a very strange kind of like, it was, but there was this, maybe it was Citizen. Oh, Genevieve got it. It's Citizen. Yeah, that's what it was. And it was like, so it's this app that you can like see by like basically by clusters where all these videos are being posted across platforms. And anyways, but my point was that like, if I saw a lot of like hot takes that were then like, if you go and look at Citizen, like you'll see what I'm talking about. But then you'd go and look at it, and it wasn't what they were talking about. And it changed by the time of day, and it changed by what was happening. And it was just like a very interesting, interesting. I'm sure someone is going to take this tweet that like some like New York Times reporter said and like use this as an example of like how this was a one-sided fight, and they proved it by this one moment that couldn't be captured by this app that was conglomerating all of these other things. Anyways, it just struck me as a very I just felt like social media was more a part of this story than I've ever seen it be a part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict before.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Hi. So you mentioned that, first of all, thank you so much. This has been incredibly informative and clear. Thank you. And actually engrossing. But I was wondering if you could talk about what the political consequences have been for the, was it Lapid? Is it Lapid the one who's trying to form a new government? What has it done? Has it just frozen everything? Has it shifted momentum one way or another?
Lapid was given 28 days to form a government. He now has 7 days left. 2 or 3 days into the fighting, then the crucial right-wing leader, Naftali Bennett is his name, who's the head of a party called Yamina, or Rightward. He was slated to be prime minister for the first 2 years of a 4-year term in a rotation agreement. And he immediately pulled out of the negotiations. He said that it would be impossible to form a government with this Islamist party, Ram, at this point in time with these hostilities going on, and he pulled out. This was after the government had been almost entirely negotiated. They were basically on their way to the president to report that Israel had a new government. Then the war used up most of the time that Lapid has. He has another week, and now today the papers are reporting that that Bennett is considering, now that the hostilities have stopped, going back and possibly joining this government again. But he is uncertain. So I think that it's most likely that Israel will now go to its 5th round of elections in 2 months, but there's still a chance that the same government that would have been formed had the hostilities not broken out will in fact take form. The possibility of Netanyahu forming a government exists, but it's very, very slight if after Lapid fails, but no one can actually see a path for him to do that. So most likely we will be heading to new elections. But one of the interesting things about this is that throughout the hostilities, the forces that want to switch Netanyahu, headed by Lapid, have insisted that that what's going on the ground does not discourage them from forming a coalition with this Ram party. And in fact, over the course of this week, Lapid investigated joining with the other Arab party, the Joint List, which is an amalgam of 3 other parties. In fact, Lapid investigated the possibility of them also supporting the coalition. The other right-wing potential coalition partners didn't go for that, but the degree to which this idea that governments in Israel can now include non-Zionist Palestinian Islamist parties or other Palestinian parties, not Islamist parties, that idea is now, I think, generally accepted, and that is an astonishing change over the course of 12 months. Nobody foresaw it coming, and that's going to have an impact on Israeli politics for years to come, though it's hard to see exactly what that impact will be.
So Corwin was about to ask the question that Scott just asked, so I'm going to assume that your answer gives rise to 100 follow-up questions and let him ask one of them.
Yeah, so my question would be a follow-up, like what happens when or if Lapid fails? Because it seems to me that Lapid is probably going to fail in forming government. Does the president send the mandate to someone else, or does he like to say, Parliament, you send the mandate to someone, or does he like to say, now for new elections, or does Naftali Bennett go with Netanyahu after that? Does the president just give the mandate back to Netanyahu and Netanyahu forms the government?
No, the president won't give the mandate back to Netanyahu. What he'll do is send the mandate back to the Knesset for 21 days. Thanks for the question, by the way. What he'll do is send it back to the Knesset, and for the 21 days following that, any member of the Knesset, any one of the 120 members of the Knesset, can come to the president with a list of 61 members of Knesset who support him as prime minister, and that person can become prime minister, which essentially means that either side can continue to try to negotiate a government. If they succeed, then they can form a government. They have, again, 21 days to do that, unless 61 members of Knesset vote to disband the Knesset, in which case you immediately go to new elections, which will be held 90 days after that happens.
Richard Wattenbarger, the floor is yours.
Okay, hello.
Hello.
So I'm still stunned and bewildered at the actions of the Israeli police at the AlAqsa Mosque. We know that it's one of the most sacred sites in Islam as well as in Judaism, but it's the sort of thing, though, that I would think would resonate far beyond Israel and Palestine to much of the Arab world. And I'm just curious, what sorts of calculations might the government have been making when or if they allowed this to happen? And have we heard reactions from Arab capitals about this?
That is an excellent question, and I have to admit I don't have a good answer. I have a couple of thoughts about it, which is first of all, I agree that it was a ridiculous miscalculation, and this isn't just with the benefit of hindsight that I can say this. I think that many people would have said that before as well. The Minister of Internal Security, Amir Ohana is his name, is very eager to curry favor with the Prime Minister, with Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's an attorney. He's an interesting fellow. He came into politics as the leader of the Likud LGBTQ lobby, and he was very interested in proving himself to be tough. And I think that it's possible that that he felt as though there's nothing tougher than sending Jewish soldiers into the AlAqsa Mosque. It's an absurd miscalculation. Maybe certainly he knew something that I don't know. Maybe I have no. It's unintelligible to me. As far as what you said, there were reactions in all the capitals. I mean, including the countries that have recently negotiated normalization agreements with Israel. There was worry expressed. There's nothing more sensitive than that 1 square kilometer of.
Yeah. But I mean, couldn't you think that this was a favor to Netanyahu? That is, this obviously works to his benefit, no? Because it at least, he gets, there's another election. So I think it feels like a gift, no?
There is a theory in some circles that Prime Minister Netanyahu, while either in the most extreme version, engineered all of this, or that he was happy to let it develop once he saw it develop because it served his political needs. And I personally don't accept that at all. I think that you could feel his alarm as things got out of hand. He is a man who I think is deeply committed to control, for all his reputation as being, a blustering thug on the international stage. He's actually extremely reticent to enter into, military conflict. And I think that it's possible that when the history is written, that it will turn out that this was a lucky break for Prime Minister Netanyahu. Maybe we'll have 5th elections and maybe he'll do better. But I think that I think that he was not pleased by these developments as they developed. As indeed, it's hard to imagine anybody being pleased by them. So I don't think that it was done because it produced benefit. Possibly it did produce benefit for Netanyahu, but there are many people who think that I'm wrong and think that the position that I'm stating is naive. That of course Prime Minister Netanyahu is behind it, but that doesn't ring true to me.
Genevieve de la Fera, the floor is yours.
Hello. I apologize if there's any redundancy in this question. I am pretty not informed. But is there a formation of the opposition government a good thing, or does it compound issues already present?
What kinds of issues already present are you talking about?
Specifically with handling situations of like cultural conflict, or particularly about how you were speaking earlier with how there would be, it sounded like the government that was going to be assembled would be pretty diverse in terms of party, although there were extreme parties involved. It was at least there'd be opposition. And so I know very little about the opposition government that has been kind of taken over. And so really, will it dial down the rhetoric, or will it add to the friction of an already fraught situation?
Thanks.
So this is a really, really great question, and because Noah is too modest to do this, I'm going to do it for him. You should all, if you're interested in this question, you should listen to the episode of Noah's podcast from 2 or 3 weeks ago when this government was about to come into existence, and Noah and Ohad and Sally, who are very different people, all in some sense of the Israeli left, had a pretty fierce argument about this exact question, whether this is basically having a not Netanyahu government that ranges from left to right actually could do anything that would be useful, or whether Naftali Bennett has kind of tricked a bunch of Israeli center-left and leftists into being excited about him being prime minister. So your question is one that is very, like, I will just say that, but it's very much dividing the worlds of both the right and the left in Israel.
Yeah, it is an excellent question, and there are a lot of people here who just want change, who just want Prime Minister Netanyahu to no longer be prime minister. And for those people, any new government would be a good government. This new government that could possibly take form under the prime ministership of Naftali Bennett and then Yair Lapid in 2 years would not be able to make steps forward on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It just has people all over the map imagined in that coalition. So in that way, there's something frustrating about it. But I think that it would be a change, and it would be able to produce a lot of things, and it would be a government that was, for the very first time, dependent on that a government that included an Islamist party in a way that I think would no doubt be good for Israel. So that would be good. But it's not the party it's not the government that I dream of at night.
Oblio, we have seen you in the Greek chorus so many times. I think this is the first time we are ever seeing your face.
No, I've been on before, but I think a couple of times.
She's been on before.
But my
Hi.
not a word. Hi. Thank you so much for this. My question is actually pretty basic. Can you define what a rocket is in terms of Hamas? Because I think Americans conjure an image of rocket that might not be in line with what they actually are.
What a great question. What an
It
amazing
is.
question.
I'm not the best person to answer this. These rockets are somewhere in between in between highly technically advanced rockets and just rockets that are built in your garage. But they do have the capacity now. Some of the rockets have the capacity to reach Tel Aviv and beyond Tel Aviv, and they can destroy a housing block with 8 apartments in them, and they are not highly accurate. They cannot target very specific places. So they're lobbed en masse. I mean, over the course of those 11 days, 4,450 rockets were fired on Israel, of which about 90% were intercepted by Israel's missile defense system, Iron Dome, which you have probably heard of. And each one of them is capable of destroying a building and killing many families, though none of them did. It's an entirely different world of ordnance than what Israel has, which Israel was attacking with bombs dropped from planes that were highly accurate and could target very specifically, and the Hamas is a very, very different thing.
And it's even a different thing from the missiles that Hezbollah has, in the north, which are longer range. They're also not especially guided, but they're somewhat more sophisticated. Jacob, the floor is yours.
Hello, hello. So one thing I would be interested in hearing is a discussion regarding Gaza's unique circumstance and the rocket firings. In all other circumstances, we'd accept that indiscriminate rocket attacks on another country would be a declaration of war. Is there a reason why we wouldn't consider this a declaration of war, or is there a reason we wouldn't or would? Or does this question presuppose that Gaza exists as a separate country that may not be a reality?
So you may think this is a question for Noah, but it is actually a question for Scott. Because this is a core international law question. And I happen to have, as Woody Allen would say of Marshall McLuhan, I happen to have an international law guy right here.
You're muted.
But he's muted.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, the thing is that Hamas is not So now correct me. So there are two governments. Palestine is split between two governments. Is this not right? There's Gaza has its own government, and the territory, the West Bank. Yeah, so one's a Palestinian Authority, and the Gaza has its. What is Gaza?
It's run by Hamas.
It's run by Hamas. So the thing is that Hamas is not recognized as having sovereignty in the international community, so it's not capable of actually declaring war. It can't actually create the conditions that trigger the laws of war. So that's if the Palestinian Authority did it, if Abbas did it, so Abbas is the prime minister, right? Yeah. If he did it, then I think launching rockets would be pretty straightforward. Not a declaration of war. There would be an act of war which triggers Article 51, the right of self-defense.
I mean, I think the basic contours of the international law debate here is the Israeli position is we withdrew from Gaza. We don't have a single troop on the ground in Gaza. Gaza is not occupied territory for purposes of international law. Therefore, attacks from Gaza fall under the unable or unwilling test. If the local authorities are unable or unwilling to quell the threat to us, we're entitled to respond to it. The conventional human rights position is Gaza is still occupied because Israel controls all access to it. And therefore, the relevant issue is a kind of Geneva IV, occupation theory that is fundamentally governed by, international human rights law and proportionality analysis. Between those two views of international law, never the twain shall meet. And I think it's fair to say that the people who accept the Israeli general view of the matter are the Israeli government, the U.S. government, certain states in the EU, Turkey when it's talking about itself, but not when it's talking about Israel, and Russia when it's talking about itself and not when it's talking about Israel. And the people who reject the analysis are basically the human rights community. I think that's the best summary I can give of the legal lay of the land standing on one foot. Shailesh, I can't bring you on screen. You're invisible, but you should be audible.
Hi, thanks for a wonderful conversation. So my question is, what are some positive, uplifting examples of peaceful coexistence and friendship in that region? And is there enough emphasis on those narratives in popular culture? Because without those kind of narratives, it's very easy to drive a wedge. And for context, I grew up in India, and we have our own share of troubles, obviously. But I can always make a credible argument that, you know, friendship is peace is the norm, and sort of these flare-ups are a departure from that norm. So how do you see that playing out in Israel? And I know nothing about that region.
Well, that's
Super great question.
Yeah, thank you. There are a large and really growing number of signs of coexistence, cooperation, working together on all sorts of different levels. I mean, if you the incoming class of the Technion, which is Israel's MIT, Israel's best technical university this year, is 1/3 Palestinian Israeli. If you go to through the course of the COVID crisis here, many people remarked the fact that that a quarter of the healthcare services in the country are provided by Palestinian Israelis, and Palestinians and Jews.
So I split at
Whoa.
18.
Keep going, Noah.
Wasn't really a percentage.
Palestinians and Jews work together in every hospital and practically every clinic in Israel, which is to say that we saw over the course of the last year a constant stream of beautiful, inspiring stories that came out of hospitals, in particular of a Jewish man who's dying of COVID-19, who has no one to read the Shema, the final prayer before he dies, which he desperately wants to hear. So his Palestinian doctor, reads it for him. So, and it's easy to dismiss those things as schmaltzy, as overly sentimental and not representative. And of course, they're not representative, but they exist and they're a real thing. And there are so many points of contact, more now than ever, in every aspect of culture. When I go out to see, my midlife crisis was that I started to go to see. I love music, popular music, so I go out every week to one show. And here in Tel Aviv, the number of Arabic language Palestinian rappers who are like in some seedy club in the south of the city, hanging out together with Jewish rappers. There's an infinity of these stories where there didn't used to be any, or basically any at all. And so exactly at the point where you're talking about, like the point of culture is a point where there is this meeting that's growing, that feels more normal than anyone thought that it could. And in addition to what we've been talking about over and over again over the course of this discussion about this political party that suddenly is possibly about to find a place in Israel's government, and it feels like this is the high water point so far of cooperation, with all sorts of points of promise for the future. And of course, it's terrible. Of course, it's not even remotely enough. And the people that dismiss that as merely symbolic and merely sentimental, I understand why they can do that. They can say, compare that to the fact that there are, outside of medicine, there are many professions where Palestinians are dramatically underrepresented and will continue to be. As in, I work at a university. Israeli universities are 3% Palestinian in a country where Palestinian citizens of Israel are 20% of the population. That's horrible. And yet, in every single area, every parameter, that is improving, and not fast enough. And what we see as a result is like growing with each little modicum of hope, frustration grows as well. And we're seeing both of those things grow at once.
All right, we got two more questions. I want to get through them. Andrew.
So from a property law perspective, what is the legal question that's driving this? How do most countries deal with these kind of questions, and what is the backstory behind it? I read Elliot Abrams' column in the National Review, but it was biased. I like Elliot for other things, but this one.
Are you talking about Sheikh Jarrah in particular? These
Yeah.
families that are being evicted?
Yeah.
Well, Ben, you probably know better than me. You can answer, or I can answer, and you can correct me.
Go ahead. You know the cultural background. I know a little bit of the law, but although I got to tell you, my Ottoman law isn't what it used to be.
Well, this is Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood in Jerusalem that was traditionally mixed, both Jewish and Palestinian. Traditionally, beginning in the 19th century. I won't go back before. I don't know to go back before then. And in 1948, then the neighborhood was conquered by the Jordanians. Most of the land was nationalized by the Jordanians. And then in 1967, it was conquered back by the Israelis, and the land that had been nationalized by the Jordanians had no official owner according to Israeli law, which is to say Israeli law forbade the Palestinian owners who had owned it, say, before 1948, from establishing a legal claim in Israeli law to those places. They were basically held in trust by the government, which allows Jewish claims from before 1948 to be brought on the land that the government held. So old Jewish claims for houses that were owned by Jews before 1948 were brought on houses that now house Palestinians. To complicate this, some of the Palestinian families had land that they owned or houses that they owned in other neighborhoods in Jerusalem, and they were forced to move from the homes they legally owned to homes that they could not legally own in Sheikh Jarrah in 1948, and have lived there for the past 73 years. Their family has.
And the Jordanians promised them title and then never delivered it.
So exactly. So then against this background, some and Israeli, or there are a couple of Israeli non-governmental organizations that are going back, checking which Jews held the title to land before 1948, buying the titles of those lands from their descendants, and then pressing their claim. And apparently, legally, this is a complicated. I mean, it sounds complicated. It is in fact complicated. The way that I think that citizens of Sheikh Jarrah see it, and also the way that I see it, is that families that have lived in these homes without paying rent, by the way, for at least 73 years, have a right to these lands, even if there is an older title that is held by somebody that it has since been acquired. So they see it as an injustice to be forced out of these homes that they have occupied for generations now. And I think that in that they are, I just think they're right.
So
go ahead, Kate.
I don't know this specific situation, obviously, but I can compare it to things in South Africa, things in native populations in the U.S. In general, kind of any give and take between when people that land is taken and then it's given back or goes back and forth. There's lots of stories of people improving land or living on land and then having other people come back in and take it back from them after having like whether they got title or not. I mean, in short, this is one of the reasons that I really truly believe in the limits of legality. I think that there are a lot of this gets really this is just law is just some bullshit that we're making up to deal with the very real situations of people having homes and people having things that they're invested in and people having emotional repercussions from being dejected from a place that they call home, and not knowing everything to do to settle that. So to some point, your point, Andrew, is just it's not really about law at all. And if people tell you that it is, I kind of think that they're giving you they're giving you whatever is the current law of the day, but that could change just as well change again in 35 years or 5 years or 75 years.
So just to, I really agree that this is a situation that is best not resolved by law, although in a highly legalized society like Israel, they don't have it's hard to come up with another vocabulary for it. But just one thing that's really complicated about all of these It's less complicated inside of Israel, although it's complicated even there. But when you get into the 67 occupied territories, and here I mean occupied with a small o and a small t, not a cap, so including the neighborhoods of Jerusalem, you're dealing with a serial rapid change of sovereign authority over a very short period of time. So you have Ottoman law governs until the end of World War I. Then you have British mandatory law in place until 47, 48. Then, depending on which side of some very arbitrary lines which run down streets you're on, you're either under Jordanian law or you're under Israeli law. And then after 67, you're under some melange of them as interpreted by the Israeli military and ultimately the Israeli Supreme Court. And so it's everything Kate says minus stable law. It just, and so often what, in some of these settlement battles, what people are fighting about legally, that's not morally what they're fighting about, but legally what they're fighting about is whether this was unclaimed state land under the Ottoman Empire, which is the least important possible question you could ask from a moral perspective. But they are, in the absence of political settlement, that's what the Israeli courts are dealing with. Charles T., you get the last question today.
My question kind of piles on to the discussion here. The High Court in Israel has given the Israeli Attorney General until June 8th to write a brief in the case. I guess an intervention of some kind. You want to discuss the ramifications of that, intervention, and for that matter, the broader ramifications of the outcome of the case, or the likelihood of the outcome of the case, rather.
I don't know how to predict where this is going to go at all, and I follow the Supreme Court. I think that there are at least some of the justices are desperately looking for a way to resolve this in a Cadian way of trying to find a solution that is not strictly their best interpretation of the cold letter of the law. But I don't know what Avichai Mandelblit, what the Attorney General is going to write, and I don't know what the government is going to do. Everyone knows that Jerusalem is a tinderbox. I think that there is broad feeling among a fair portion of the legal establishment that whatever the case of the law is, again, like you said, Kate, that justice demands that these families be allowed to continue to live there. There was one of the justices tried to strike a compromise already last month, saying to the families, if you are willing to begin to pay rent on these houses, which is to say, if you are willing officially to recognize that these houses belong to someone else, we will let you stay, which was rejected immediately, obviously, by Michael Sfard, the attorney for the families in Sheikh Jarrah. But it I think shows her willingness with her fingernails to find some kind of solution that allows her both to say, I have been true to the law and I have been true to kind of the soul of the morality of this. I think they're going to search for something like that, and I have no idea what's going to happen. And I do think that it's possible that the country will just explode into violence if it goes one way and not another way.
We're going to leave it on that less than cheerful note. Noah Efron, you're a great American and a great Israeli and a great citizen of the virtual world. Come back and join us in more cheerful times. And we will, and in the meantime, go to bed.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Noah. This was amazing. I learned so much. This was incredible.
Yeah.
So great.
We will be back.
I'm embarrassed to say it, but I had fun. I know we're not allowed to have
you're
fun.
You're not allowed to say that. Noah did not have fun. He did not enjoy himself. We are going to be back 22 hours and 50 minutes from now talking ransomware with Nick Weaver. I will be on a train, and as yesterday showed, I cannot promise connectivity success under those situations, but we'll do what we can. That'll be 22 hours and 50 minutes from now. And until then, Scott?
We can't have fun anymore, but we can do it at the same, we can do it across multiple time zones.
And just think, if we